Christians are rapidly abandoning their support for Israel, and it's a sign of the end times. And you are probably wondering why. So today we're going to explain why Christians are giving Israel up and why it's a sign of the end times. And we're starting right now. Christians may not realize it, but eschatological beliefs of Christians are probably the primary reason that the USA and other Western democracies have supported Israel in the past. In 1948, when Israel was restored as a nation, the majority of the USA were Christians, and they knew their Bible and the role Israel played. Now, secular support for Israel is rapidly decreasing all over the world, and even support among Christians is dropping. So, when will the USA become Israel's enemy and not their friend? A question to ask first is, so what? Should Christians support Israel at all? On the one hand, we are exhorted in Scripture to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, Psalm 122:6, and told that those who bless Abraham, and by extension Israel, will be blessed, Genesis 12:3. This channel believes God still has a covenant relationship with Israel and unfulfilled promises with Israel that he will fulfill in the future. And as a channel, we support Israel by default, and in particular, its right to the land. On the other hand, this doesn't mean that the government, people, or policies of Israel are beyond criticism. We can and should judge their action against biblical principles. We can support Israel and still criticize the government. Remember, Israel is a secular nation, 99% unsaved. It's the potential for that 99% to be saved and to fulfill God's promises to them that causes our support. Also, many Palestinians are Christians or will become Christians before the return of Jesus. So they are currently our brothers and sisters, or many of them will be. We need to view our role in any conflict between these two groups as loving others and attempting to lead them to Christ regardless of their ethnic background. However, as a default, we support Israel's right to exist and its right to the land God promised them. However, the USA is a secular nation, and there is no doubt that the far left in the USA have completely abandoned Israel, at least in their minds. Now, Black Lives Matter recently tweeted their support of the Palestinians and made it into a racial issue. White Israel oppressing darker-skinned Palestinians. Now, Fox News and other right-leaning organizations quickly jumped on BLM for supporting the terrorist group Hamas. But BLM responded that they were supporting the oppressed Palestinians and not Hamas. They drew a distinction. Changing the narrative into one about race had massive effects on the left in the USA that you may not realize happened. Many leftist politicians have had a historic affiliation with Israel. After all, Chuck Schumer, the majority leader of the Senate from New York, is an example. Schumer began the recent Israeli-Hamas conflict by saying Israel had a right to defend itself. He has always been a pro-Israel hawk. But after the BLM tweet, he became uncharacteristically silent. President Biden did even more. He began the conflict supporting Israel's right to defend itself, but after the BLM tweet, he stopped saying that and even began demanding Israel join into a ceasefire. The racial focus won over the leftist half of the country in a stunning reversal overnight. Notice that the BLM tweet also struck a perceived division between Hamas, the terrorists, and the Palestinians, the people. How can Israel defend itself against a rocket-firing group that surrounds itself with what seems like innocent civilians and children? Israel is in the middle of a public perception predicament, and the media is driving this narrative that Israel is the aggressor. At this same time, internationally, Turkey has been stirring up a coalition of Middle Eastern and European groups against Israel. meeting with Putin, as we've reported on in this channel, and even with the Pope. So only the USA seems to remain with Israel. But that appears as if it will change too. Israel's last friends in the USA, the Evangelical Christians, are turning their backs on Israel. A new Barna survey points out that there is a radical shift in young evangelical Christians who are rapidly revising their views on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. As we indicated, the USA doesn't really have a good secular geopolitical reason for supporting Israel. Yes, Israel is a good economic partner, but geopolitically, the Arab world and its oil are much more strategically important. Only Israel's connection to the USA Christians have kept it within America's group of allies. And while Christians have been a major supporter of Israel in the past, this Barna Group poll indicates a sharp drop in support for the Jewish state and raises concerns that Israel is about to lose their key ally going forward. The poll asked over 700 evangelical Christians between the ages of 18 and 29 where they placed their support in the Israel-Palestinian dispute. Only 34% said with Israel. Just 3 years ago, it was 69% of young evangelicals who said they sided with Israel. This is an incredible drop of like 50% in this age group's support since only 2018. What changed in the last 3 years? Nearly half the young respondents admitted to having very limited or no knowledge at all of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That, of course, means that the little bit they do know, they're getting from the media. No wonder that Israel's support is dropping in this group. It also means they are not getting their views from the pulpit. And that is what I believe is the greatest failure in the last few years. Evangelicals have historically supported Israel based on their end-time theology, which connects the state of Israel with the second coming of Jesus. But pastors are teaching about end times in ever-decreasing numbers. At the closer we're getting to Jesus' coming, and there are fewer and fewer pastors saying anything about it. This same survey found 65% of the Christians in the survey said they never heard the importance of supporting Israel in their church. Wow! That wouldn't be possible if those churches' pastors were preaching the full counsel of God. And that is why this ministry is planning an entire video series to help you share with your pastor why they should be preaching end times right now. And also what's in it for them and the church. Because unfortunately, that's probably something that we need to communicate to them. Because there's a reason they're not preaching end times. So why is this difference occurring between young and older Christians? Well, one reason is the older Christians remember a time when end times were preached from the pulpit. Another difference is that younger Christians are less conservative and more easily swayed by the liberal media. So Christians should not be surprised by any of this. End-time passages show that in the end, Israel will be alone against the nations. That's why this is an end-time sign. The Bible prophesies a final assault against Jerusalem at the midpoint. Ezekiel 38:39, Joel 12:1, Joel 3:9 through 16, Zechariah 12:1 through 9. In Zechariah we see, quote, all the nations of the earth will gather against it, meaning Jerusalem. So we shouldn't be surprised that the USA and other Western democracies will be aligned against Israel by the midpoint of the 70th week of Daniel when that assault happens. In Ezekiel 38, when the Gog-Magog alliance invades Israel, Tarshish, which symbolically represents the West, asks the Antichrist alliance why they're invading, but does nothing to stop the invasion. So the USA abandoning Israel is a sign of the end times and an eventual fulfillment of these passages. Now, has the USA already reached a breaking point in its support for Israel? I'm sure you've seen the anti-Israel protests all across the United States in the last few weeks as the conflict raged between Israel and Palestinians. and also seen them spill over into anti-Semitic hate crimes against American Jews. This is the direction that the USA seems to be moving. Yael Hirschfeld, the Anti-Defamation League of Florida, has this to say. They're coming every day. Every minute we are getting reports of these hate crimes. There was a 40% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in 2020, and now there are more. Hirschfeld said many of these incidents are occurring along the lines that are already dividing the USA, racial and political, with BLM leading the effort against Israel. BLM's founders are Islamic after all, so it makes sense that they take sides against Israel. And since the BLM movement has become so politically popular with the media, this will drive the USA's younger and more liberal folks away from supporting Israel. It is our opinion that based on these shifting allegiances among Christians, sometime during the Biden administration, the USA will take a decidedly anti-Israel position, and only a minority of Christians will have the will to oppose it. This will, of course, lead to persecution of that small minority who opposes it. If you support Israel, plan to be persecuted just like they will be. In fact, is it too late for the USA as a nation? Click right here to learn whether there will be any revival of the Christian nation that the USA used to be, or has God given the nation over to a reprobate mind? This is Nelson, and I'll see you there.